Illinois State University Visiting Artist Program. Welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time, and welcome back to those of you who have joined us before. In a minute, I'm going to turn this over to Melissa Reski, who will introduce our visitor for this week. We'd like to request that as you develop questions for our speaker, that you add those to the chat, and the graduate program, the program graduate assistant, Asa Carl, who is here, will monitor those questions and read them to the speaker after the talk is concluded. With that, I think we're ready to go. Melissa?
Okay, so I am really excited and honored to introduce Dr. Giovanni Aloi to you this evening. Giovanni's lecture was supposed to be a part of a longer campus visit, which we still plan to host next fall in conjunction with university galleries and the ISU Horticulture Center. So hopefully this lecture will just be a preview for more extensive, more cross-disciplinary collaboration. Through his expansive and prolific work as an author, editor, and educator, Dr. Aloi is a great facilitator and advocate for artists and scholars who, like himself, recognize the urgent need to rethink our relationships to the environment and to non-human life. How artists represent and work with animals, plants, and nature informs how we regard and treat them within our culture and society. Dr. Aloi is the editor-in-chief of Antenna, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture, which he founded in 2006. He's co-editor of the Art After Nature series, published by the University of Minnesota Press. And he teaches in the Department of Art History Theory and Criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and at Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York and London. Dr. Aloi has published many books, including Art and Animals in 2011, Speculative Taxidermy, Natural History, Animal Surfaces, and Art in the Anthropocene in 2018, Why Look at Plants? The Botanical Emergence in Contemporary Art in 2019, which is one that I particularly love. And most recently, Lucian Freud Herbarium, which provides the topic for tonight's lecture titled Lucian Freud, Plants, Painting, and Silence. So I'm very, very excited. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Giovanni Aloi.
Thank you very much, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here virtually tonight. Thanks to everyone for coming, and I hope you'll enjoy my presentation. It is predominantly based on Lucian Freud and his paintings of potted plants, which is a slight twist on the, or let's say a specific theme in the book that I wrote now a couple of years ago that was published last year. I trust you all see the screen. The slide is on. Fabulous. That's great. And just wanted to quickly begin with a quick overview of what Melissa just mentioned. This is the 51 front covers of Antenna, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture, which you can download for free at www.antenna.org.uk. It's a journal dedicated entirely to nature and art. And we also have a couple of issues dedicated to plants, published in 2011, and 3 more. One published in July this year, and 2 more coming in November and March next year. So plants have always been important in my work as well as Antenna. This is a few of my books, starting from Art and Animals at the very beginning on the left and ending with Animal, published by Phaidon last year. I just wanted to flash them at you to convey the sense that I've always been interested in nature throughout my career, but that initially in the early 2000s I worked in the field of animal studies, which informs my outlook on plants to quite a degree. So I just care to bring that to the fore because it will feed into the end of the talk today. A new co-author book that's just been published last week. It's Flower, again, another collaboration with Phaidon. It's technically a book filled with commentaries by different authors on the most amazing images of flowers created by artists, scientists, and other creatives in throughout the world and across time. I'm very much interested in issues of engagement and knowledge transfer, how academic knowledge can be put to work outside academia, and this is where these books come in. And Lucian Freud Herbarium, which, as we said, is the subject of tonight's talk. A big adventure for me on a number of levels. First of all, because it was a lot of fun working on it, and because any excuse to look at plants, whether in real life or in representation, is just a great way to spend my time. Whenever, something doesn't go quite right, you feel down, you always remember there's more. There's plants out there and animals until we kill them all. That's a different talk, right? So let's focus on the fact that they're still out there and that we love to learn more and more about them. So I am going to talk to you briefly about Lucian Freud, just from the point of view of an introduction, because I lived 20 years in London, and when I arrived in London in the late 90s, Lucian Freud was everywhere. It was clear that it was a master, that it commanded a lot of attention on the art scene. It wasn't that well known in Italy, where I come from, and I know his fame in the US is limited in comparison to his fame in Europe right now. He passed away in 2011, and as it happens for many artists, he really found great success towards the end of his life, roughly starting around the 80s and 90s, and then by 2011 it just exploded in this incredible stardom in painting, considered to be one of the most influential painter of the last century. And if the name rings a bell, probably a big bell, you are on the right track. In fact, there he is, Lucian Freud on the right-hand side with his grandfather, Sigmund. He's the nephew of Sigmund, and it's fascinating how that relationship shaped him positively and negatively. Later on in his life, although he was very close to Sigmund, Lucian Freud would resist any psychological reading of his paintings. And as you can imagine, reporters, critics, art historians would inevitably pop the Sigmund question every time he painted something. And he would be very protective of that notion, always claiming that his work is not about psychoanalysis, which is actually something that we're going to explore tonight together. He was born in Berlin, and his father was an architect, so upper middle class, doing quite well financially. Unfortunately, since he was Jewish, his family had to flee Germany in 1933 when Hitler rose to power, and he found shelter in London. Now, of course, that's also where Sigmund Freud found shelter for the same reason. And Lucian's youth was complicated by language, which is another important thread we will explore tonight. Language, plants, difficulties in communication, the silence of plants. It all ties together in a number of ways, as I hope I will demonstrate. Apparently, Lucian struggled with his English, and as a German speaking kid, and that led to brawls and fights with other kids who couldn't understand him, which actually led him to develop a close affinity with animals, a close bond with animals. He would always say that he loved to spend time with horses and sleep in the stable rather than spend time with the kids, playing with other kids and friends. And this bond with animals really continues as a constant throughout his life. He paints animals extensively. He also loves his dogs. Later on in life, again, he paints them regularly. There are quite a few portraits of Ellie, one of his whippets. Again, the horse we just saw, he painted. And It is unclear when Lucian Freud developed his interest in plants, but we know that he studied with Cedric Morris. Cedric Morris is, again, not very well known in the US, but is another very popular name in the United Kingdom. And Cedric Morris loved flowers. He painted flowers in a way that exalted the colors, the exuberance, a kind of modern take on the traditional still life of the 17th century. And Lucian Freud was certainly shaped by Cedric Morris, his love for plants, and generally painting since 1979, when he moved to East Anglia and studied there at the school that Cedric Morris established. Unfortunately, school that apparently Lucian Freud burned down to the ground, quite literally, while smoking a cigar and forgetting it lit at night. Not the greatest of students, however, though he apparently was forgiven by Morris, who continued to tutor him thereafter. And from that point onward, we find Lucian Freud engaging with plants in very idiosyncratic ways. His early style during the 1930s and 40s is very linear. You can see how his style is almost a reprise of botanical illustration. We have a lot of plain backgrounds and plants isolated from their environment. The linearity is extremely stark and precise, and it's a sign of what is about to come. Lucian Freud develops an incredible ability to look at the subject he paints that has an existentialist quality. It's about getting deeper under the surface in order to record anything he can see, to try to get to a level of truth that he thinks is really essential to his painting project. All of his body of work, especially from the 1940s onward, seems to be concerned with this idea that realism is ultimately an epistemological tool that can be put to good use in order to study reality, not just to represent it, but to understand what being present actually means. And I'm going to return to this subject later on tonight, but I wanted to highlight the important correlation between the idea of realism. Now, Lucian Freud was a faithful realist painter throughout his career. He never painted a single abstract work. And even when abstract expressionism became big, even when pop art became big, he never joined any of these styles. He always remained faithful to his approach to painting because it was part of his existentialist journey. It was part of his discovery of reality and his desire to gain access to reality. One time he did say that he wanted to observe something with such intensity and bring it onto the canvas so that the life of the subject could be transposed onto the canvas. So it really, these statements give you an idea of the intensity at play in his work. And symbolism is his enemy. We're going to look at why symbolism is the enemy of Lucian Freud, and I'm thinking about classical symbolism especially. Lucian Freud at times is capable of crafting his own personal symbolism, but there is a difference between idiosyncratic symbolism that we assign to objects and people or historical moments around us, and the symbolism that it's classical and it's imposed upon everything as a code to be unlocked. And of course, then there is silence. I'm going to talk about the relationship between realism, symbolism, and silence in the works of Lucian Freud, and how, by rejecting symbolism, he is able to get to a level of silence that is unnerving, that is existentialist in essence, to the point that it makes it hard to look at the canvas without feeling something, without feeling almost a vibration, a sense of presence that exceeds other paintings that have been made by other artists. So one of the most important things about Lucian Freud's approach to plants is that it substantially diverged from the tradition of the classical still life. And I'm going to show you an example of those in a minute. But I wanted to show you what probably is Lucian Freud's masterpiece, according to many, when it comes to painting plants. I've actually not mentioned that Lucian Freud painted plants constantly throughout his career. Sometimes there were gaps here and there of a few years, then he returns to the subject. But when you look at the overall arc of his career, you can see how it was a subject that he really cared about. And art historians have obviously ignored it because painting plants was considered to be a subgenre at the bottom rank of the art history hierarchy of genres. And it was also perceived as a feminine subject because of the history of still life painting. He basically painted over 100 paintings and drawings, so that's a substantial amount. It has been estimated that a fifth of his output throughout his life is plants. So you can see why omitting it, not talking about the subject, is peculiar and conspicuous. But that gave me the opportunity to write the book I wrote. So I'm pretty pleased that art historians and critics have a problem with plants. Like they have a problem with animals, but mostly plants are still at the very edge of the, what can be discussed without sounding ridiculous or falling into sentimentality that many claim shouldn't have place in academia or just in art criticism. So this is two plants, and what's really fascinating about two plants in the context of the still life genre is how different it is. These plants were brought into the studio and painted over the stretch of 2.5 years. You can imagine that they've changed consistently, and Lucian Freud never worked from photographs. This is how he establishes a direct relationship with the subject by recording the way in which it changes over time through multiple settings. Over 100 settings would be usually needed for his human subjects. And in this case, two plants just went absolutely overboard. The artist did say that he thought he was going to be driven mad by the painting because every single leaf he painted is basically a little portrait. That's how he qualified it. And he said that it was as if he were composing a very complicated piece of classical music where if you changed one part, then other parts would fall out of kilter and ruin the overall composition. It's incredibly detailed, as you can see here in these close-ups. And the two plants he's painted are Aspidistra, here at the bottom, and the close-up here is of Helichrysum. Both plants have no meaning in the Florilegium tradition of the language of flowers. They are not charged with any religious meaning that it's conveyed by a flower or a leaf. And this is what allows these plants to bathe in this silence. The fact that they don't have a symbolic pre-encoded meaning that we're expected to access allows us to stare at these beautiful images of plants without wanting to get underneath the surface to be carried away, far away from the plants by some transcendental meaning. I'm going to return to this concept, but I wanted to approach it through a very interesting idea Michel Foucault put on the map on his book on Manet. His book on Manet was meant to be part of a broader analysis of art that unfortunately was never published. But in his book on Manet, Foucault talks about the concept of Quattrocento painting. Quattrocento painting is basically Renaissance painting. It's like 15th century painting. A painting in which all classical conventions of spatial construction are used in order to produce affirmation, the central presence of the viewer as ordering agent of representation. This is most visible when we stand in front of Renaissance paintings employing central perspective. You as the viewer become the center of the world. The world is laid out for you to access in the clearest and most objectifying of ways. But there is something quite interesting about the essence of Quattrocento painting that applies to many paintings in the tradition of Western art. And it's the affirmation that Foucault talks about. Most paintings in classical art, in Western classical art, say something to us. They have something to say, and this something starts with "this is." They affirm. They have codes designed for the viewer to unlock. And this is particularly visible in the beautiful still life paintings I mentioned earlier. This is one of my favorite paintings at the Art Institute of Chicago by Louise Moyon, a French female artist who made this painting in her very early 20s. I think she was 21 when she made this. Absolutely stunning. I bring my students there to shame them. And what's fascinating about it is that not only the realism is impeccable, but of course, we know that these artworks were religious paintings in disguise. The purpose of the painting is not to just let us enjoy the beauty of these fruits or plants, but is to deliver a moral, Christian morals. So, for instance, those who looked at the painting and those who commissioned it at the time would know how to break down the code that addresses the "this is" function of the painting. So, for instance, the cherries that we see represent the Passion of Christ. And so do the grapes on the right-hand side, which are associated with the Eucharist. The plums are also related to the passion and death of Christ because of the livid color. And the peaches apparently symbolize the Trinity. This is because the peach is triparted. There is the stone in the middle, the pulp, and then the skin around it. And the asparagus that we see on the right-hand side symbolizing fertility and abundance. The meaning encoded in these paintings could also be highly idiosyncratic, which makes the whole decoding really complicated for us today. For instance, on the left-hand side, you can see a pod with 2 broad beans next to another pod with peas. And for a while, art historians really scratched their heads trying to work out what would they mean? Why are they there? And it may have been a detail added upon request of the commissioners, the family that commissioned it, in which the mother and father are represented by the broad bean and the son and daughters by the peas in separate pots. For those of you who are really keen to unlock the meaning of the painting, there's also 3 flies, one of which you can actually see here on the grapes. And the 3 flies, there's another one right here, represent death. So you can see the paradox. We're actually invited to look at nature. We're invited to look at plants and fruits. But technically, we're invited to look away by symbolism and to think about matters that are exclusively concerned with the human. So there's an anthropocentric quality. This is the paradox of classical art and the representation of nature. The more classical art shows us nature, the more we're looking at reflections of ourselves. And beautiful they are, but we're not really looking at flowers just for the desire to know more about nature. We're looking at nature because we want to learn more about us. And also to use nature as a tool that ventriloquizes human virtue. You can see here roses symbolizing love, and the poppy, which symbolizes death and sleep, and again the butterfly symbolizing the human soul, and the moth symbolizing death, meaningfully landed on the peony poppy that we see there. As you can see, like everything in these paintings is absolutely embroiled in symbolic readings. And I might want to be provocative here and claim that symbolism is a form of violence, a representational violence against plants and animals. It's a form of muting, it's a form of subjugation, and it runs through the history of art. It doesn't stop with the 16th and 17th century still lifes, which, as I'm sure you will remember, were produced to circumnavigate the prescriptive limitations of the Protestant Church that forbade the representation of sacred imagery. We find here this beautiful work by John Everett Millais, Ophelia, in which, again, the constellation of flowers around her is essentially a symbolic structure that enables us to break the code, which then unleashes the meaning of the painting. Here again, poppies symbolize death. Some of the meanings were more or less universally acknowledged across certain cultures, especially in Britain and France. Others were more idiosyncratic and were placed in the painting specifically upon request of the commissioner. So here we encounter the first important issue of tonight. The idea of realism is essential. If you paint flowers in an abstract way as the artist, and if the flower is not recognizable or the plant is not recognizable and identifiable in an accurate way, then the meaning, the symbolic meaning, cannot be attributed to it very clearly. So you can see this thread between realism and symbolism, but also this idea of silence, the notion that plants are silent beings that have been made to ventriloquize human desires, morals, and ethics of a religious kind. So here's where we find the violence that I mentioned a second ago. And it's this set of complications that I explore through the work of Lucian Freud, because he really strips off his plans of symbolism and presents them to us in ways that are unprecedented in the history of art. Before we return to Lucian Freud, I would like to read you a poem, which is something I probably have done very rarely in my career, but here you go. This is a beautiful poem called The Silence of Plants, and it was written in 2001 by a Polish poet called Maria Wisława Anna Szymborska. Essayist, translator, and recipient of the 1996 Nobel Prize in Literature. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2012. So, The Silence of Plants. A one-sided relationship is developing quite well between you and me. I know what a leaf, petal, kernel, cone, and stem are, and I know what happens to you in April and December. Though my curiosity is unrequited, I gladly stoop for some of you, and for others I crane my neck. I have names for you: maple, burdock, liverwort, either, juniper, mistletoe, and forget-me-not. But you have none for me. After all, we share a common journey. When traveling together, it's normal to talk, exchanging remarks, say about the weather, or about the stations flashing past. We wouldn't run out of topics, for so much connects us. The same star keeps us in reach. We cast shadows according to the same laws. Both of us at least try to know something, each in our own way, and even in what we don't know, there lies a resemblance. Just ask, and I will explain as best as I can. What is to see through my eyes, why my heart beats, and how come my body is unrooted? But how does someone answer questions which have never been posed, and when, on top of that, the one who would answer is such an utter nobody to you? Undergrowth, shrubbery, meadows, and rushes. Everything I say to you is a monologue, and it is not you who's listening. A conversation with you is necessary and impossible, urgent in a hurried life. One of the things I find particularly fascinating about this poem is the deliberate ambiguity. This notion of silence, the impossibility of an answer, and yet this flickering of the human and the plant in a way that doesn't feel necessarily coercive or objectifying. There's a livingness to it. There is something fascinating about the reflection of silence itself as an inescapable dimension that defines our relationship with plants. And here I wanted to get at this point a little bit deeper into this conception of listening and silence. I'm going to look at silence first and then move to listening through the work of Lucian Freud. Conceptions of silence, of course, abound in the history of philosophy, and I am just fond of Merleau-Ponty in a number of ways, and his conception of silence as a quintessential dimension of philosophy itself. To him, philosophy directs this question to our mute life. It addresses itself to that compound of the world and ourselves that precedes reflection. There is something about phenomenology, something about the encounter with, I'm saying the plant right now, but I could be saying anything else. It could be a lamp, it could be even a person that's not necessarily engaging with us. There is a moment of silence in that encounter, phenomenology experience, that precedes reflection. And it's there that the possibility of philosophy emerges. It is there that the question of philosophy unravels. So Lucian Freud staged encounters with plants often in his career. This is one of his most enigmatic and outstanding works of art, the earliest in his realist turn. I showed you earlier the very linear and more synthetic works of his youth. Then in 1951, after deciding that he no longer wants to work with paper and pencils and watercolor, he turns to oil and he unleashes these incredible hyper-realist paintings that do all sorts of things, but certainly don't say this is in the tradition of classical art. In fact, these are the opposite. They are non-affirmative paintings. They pose questions about the nature of the encounter, questions about the agency of bodies and relationships. One of the most powerful strategies Lucian Freud very simply actuates in this painting, and you will see that he does it over and over in the other examples I will show you, is to reverse the tradition of the plant in the background by positioning the plant in the foreground. So he undermines the importance of the human here, and as you can see within the perspective, he makes the plant as tall as the human, so to produce a kind of equivalence between the two, an ontological equivalence of sort. Who is confronting who? What is the situation that Lucian Freud is attempting to outline here? We know that the figure on the left-hand side is Harry Diamond, a friend of Lucian Freud, who had endured substantial abuse throughout his life, and who Lucian Freud reported had difficulties communicating with others. So we have an interesting connection here between Lucian Freud himself, the challenges he has to communicate with others, so this feeling separate from society, feeling different and alienated, and this subject, Harry Diamond, that also faces a number of challenges. In one of his biographers, Freud said that it was more likely to hear Harry Diamond grunt than actually speak. And the situation is so ambiguous that it really imparts almost an equivalent amount of agency to the plant and the human. As Harry Diamond come back from a walk to find the plant has moved on its own. It sounds out of this world, but look at the carpet. We can actually zoom right to it here at the bottom, and you can see that it appears to be unsettled. It's as if that unsettled quality is reflected in this confrontation. Why is Diamond looking at the plant with such intensity, as if he were to question the plant? What happened in my absence? Or did he just forget that he moved the plant before he left the apartment, and upon returning, the presence, the new location, let's say the plant has been moved by him earlier in the day, makes the plant stand out. So it doesn't make it recede into the background, to the point that he's aware of the individuality of the plant. And of course, all these questions remain open and endless. It's that idea that I love about Freud. He really likes to make us uncomfortable about the situation he stages. And one of the aspects of his work that I am particularly fond of is this unashamed desire to represent pots. So in the history of classical still life painting, pots are never visible. They were used all around the 16th century, the 17th centuries, in the orangerie, in the greenhouses. It's not like pots don't exist and were created afterwards. They just don't quite fit the aesthetic of those paintings, so they are sidelined. But look at Lucian Freud's pots. They're broken, they're real, they contain the plant, and what I argue in the book is that they actually turn the plant into an individual of some kind. That's how I became more interested in the way Lucian Freud represents house plants as one of the most recurring subjects in his career, which is very different, not just from the tradition of art history in general. It's also contrary to the philosophical tradition of generalizing plants as multiples, plants as ultimate multitudes that do not relate to us, or that we cannot relate to on an individual basis. So the pot works as an individualizer in a sense. And I'm interested in pots. I really think we have overlooked pots from a semantic perspective in art, as well as in... Is it possible to mute? There you go. Thank you. So I want to think about pots as something that really contributes to our conception of our relationship with plants. And even in the sense of domesticity, what does it mean when philosophy is so concerned with the notion of plants as a transcendental multitude, to think about plants as the localized, as the situated, as the individualized by the pot. And I wanted to talk and read another extract from a fantastic play. This is a piece of performance art that I certainly recommend you might try to catch when theaters open again. And it's by Manuela Infante. It translates into vegetative state, reads Estado Vegetal. And it is an incredible polyvocal performance, a polyvocal monologue in which the main actress, Manuela Infante, worked with the co-writer Marcela Salinas to create Estado Vegetal. And she's basically on stage for nearly 2 hours on her own with plants. And the performance is extremely charged, extremely revealing. And I don't want to say too much. I can't reveal too much about it. But I wanted to read the script of this conversation that this elderly lady engages with her potted plants. And it's particularly fascinating. I'm going to try to give it some delivery as well. Manuela Infante will forgive me. You're very pale. You need more light, my sweetie. I'm going to put you here. Do you feel better then, hon? Great. And you, my dear, are too big. I'm going to have to do something about you. You're drinking too much water. Hey, look at you. You keep getting blonder. You're in your prime, love. You know, I'm going to have to move you to another pot. This flower pot doesn't suit you anymore. No. Of course, a bigger flower pot. That's what I was telling you. What? No, I'm not running off. Of course, love. I can't get closer. Tell me. What? Are you threatening me? What do you mean I'm not understanding your problem? Of space? That's what I'm saying. No? Don't shout at me, darling. I have my device turned on. Now what, my love? But all of you? All of you on the floor? How? Yes, my sweetie, but you see the problem is that the earth is under the floor. What do you mean lift it? The floor? You want me to lift the floor so I can bury you? Forgive me for laughing, my love, but it seems to me like this is too much. But why would you want me to tear up the floor of my house? What do you mean it's not my house? What do you mean you were here before me? And then in the following sequence, the monologue picks up again and returns to the subject in which a witness to the aftermath of this lifting of the floor and moving the plants to the ground explain what they saw. I remember that in that room inside, she had taken out the whole floor and had planted all the plants in the ground below. She had taken them out of the pots. There was a tower of flower pots in a corner. I remember clearly that I thought the plants had kind of rebelled against the pots. You see, flower pots were an invention of humans to do what they will and move. How could I say? The immovable. There's a reason plants grow roots, you know? The lady was like, how can I explain? She was like, because she stayed and she was planted. She had her legs buried in the ground like this, up to the height of her thigh, more or less. She was buried like a plant right there in the earth. She had raised all the floorboards and she had taken all the plants in the house. And I am talking about a huge amount of plants. So this is just one of the incredible sections of Estado Vegetal in which the polyvocal monologue incorporates different voices, which again flicker between human and plant in very free way, and very interesting ideas which Manuela Infante made no mystery come from the philosophy of Michael Marder and the research of Stefano Mancuso, the neurobiologist, plant neurobiologist from Italy, have generated. And I wanted to further contextualize this with the work I did for Why Look at Plants. With this project, which is co-authored with many interesting scholars and artists, I wanted to harness a Foucauldian idea in which space is intrinsic to power relations. Therefore, a plant in your living room and the power relations you establish with it, the relationship you establish with it, it's very different from the power relations that play with a plant in the lobby of a hotel, or in a holiday home, or in a supermarket, or a gardening center. So I have been trying to, in my work, individualize plants in a relational sense as much as possible without following into anthropomorphic cliches. And of course, there's a sense of frustration. The whole project is complex and challenging in a number of ways. But I think that we owe it to plants after the centuries of objectification and imposition of our voice upon them to engage. We owe them an engagement that it's not necessarily based on purely anthropomorphic grounds. So I just wanted to show you a few more works by Lucian Freud in which he paints potted plants. There's a beautiful one here that it's finished, probably a dino kale, but you can still see the pot there. It was going for a pot again. And this, which is actually a very recent discovery, which somebody happened to have in the loft. Sometimes people look in the loft and find the Lucian Freud, which is a very small section of a larger canvas that was never finished and was gifted to one of his lovers. And of course, the respect that Lucian Freud has for plants and the ways in which he represents plants place the plants in a similar ontological level to the other objects and subjects in the painting. So it seems like the male model, the dog, the piece of furniture, and the plant are given the same gravitas. And once Lucian Freud said that he would just constantly return to everything in the painting as if it were the sole protagonist of it all. This is one of the most interesting works by Lucian Freud, very controversial because the little girl you see at the base of this potted plant is one of his daughter. Lucian Freud had 14 legitimate children, and some claim 40 in total, including the illegitimate ones. And here we see an interesting composition, perhaps a painting that speaks of vulnerability, in which again we see that equalization between the child on the ground, the plant, and the coat hanging on the wall. What's interesting here about the work is the plant in itself, which I had the opportunity to encounter in person when I visited the studio of the artist in London just last year. It's a Zemelinda, and a Zemelinda is also Sparmannia africana. Sparmannia africana has a very interesting history. It was a very fashionable plant in Germany and Austria during the 1920s and 30s. It's clearly not from that climate, and it was kept as a house plant, apparently by intellectuals especially. So Sigmund Freud had Zemelinda in his studio in Vienna, and then proceeded to take Zemelinda to London when he fled. And he also gave the Zemelinda to Lucian. So the Zemelinda that we see in this painting is almost a family emblem, which is different from assigning a classical symbol, Christian symbol, to a plant. But it's when our relationship with plants become idiosyncratic, when our relationship with plants becomes crosses generations, and when our relationship with plants has a meaning that it's personal and specific. So keeping that plant alive means keeping alive the memory of those who have passed it along and those who grew it initially. Plants have this ability to multiply and at the same time to retain something of the individual that it's much stronger than animals and humans in a sense. And I can also show you that this Zemelinda wasn't particularly happy. One of the things I love about Lucian Freud is that despite the fact that he had all these plants in his house all the time throughout his life and that he painted them often, he wasn't a green thumb gardener like, we would assume people who always surround themselves with plants end up becoming. And this is what Sparmannia africana really looks when, as you can see, like in the Freud painting, when it doesn't receive enough light and it's sort of overlooked a little in terms of watering. But this is what Sparmannia africana should look like in the right climate. So you can see that it's a lot bushier, lush, and happy just generally. That is actually a very interesting aspect, I think, of houseplants that is mostly gone unnoticed. How houseplants are really shaped by this dialogue between us and them, which is not verbal. It's a dialogue based on actions, proximity, decisions, and responses by the plant. There's a secret vocabulary that every one of us has to learn in order to keep plants alive in an apartment. you have to become able to read the angle of the leaves, the intensity of the green, and other signs of stress, unhappiness, and joy in order to develop this bridge with the plant. And those people who always claim, oh, I just kill him and I can't, it's actually more than just forgetfulness. I think it's just a certain non-training or a lack of inclination to read the plant, not just as an aesthetic being for joy and pleasure, but read the plant as a living being that has needs and that has demands upon us, who are the providers in this relationship, or one of the two providers, but certainly the providers of water in most cases, and light. So here we get to the idea of listening. What is this relationship based on? I just said that the relationship that we establish with houseplants is different from the forest, is different from the plants out there. It's more individualized, and it's based on a shared history. The Zemelinda case with Sigmund Freud and Lucian Freud, this tradition passed on from grandfather to grandson, and also the children of Lucian Freud, some of them have cuttings from that Zemelinda that they are continuing to grow themselves. The disability that potted plants can have to become more meaningful in a personal way and to establish long-lasting dialogues and to congeal histories, it is part of a different kind of vocalizing, listening, and silent language. And I am particularly interested in Roland Barthes and his conception of listening. To him, to listen means to adopt an attitude of decoding what is obscure, blurred, or mute, in order to make available to consciousness the underside of meaning. And I really think in that underside of meaning, that's where plants reside. If we allow them to be engulfed in that incredible silence that characterizes them, that's where they are. And this constant imposition of symbolic meanings upon them, meanings that have got nothing to do with them, mutes the possibility for us to develop a personal dialogue based on idiosyncratic vocabularies. And also, it prevents us from entering this dimension of silence, this notion that perhaps there is something in that emptiness that we read as emptiness because we have been miseducated from an anthropocentric perspective to assume, to respect the centrality of the voice, the centrality of the word. And in this case, in this context, rather say, this is the painting that's been haunting me for years. It perhaps is my most favorite painting by Lucian Freud. Perhaps more unusual and daring than any of the ones I've showed you so far tonight. This is a Pandanus. Again, not a symbolic plant in the tradition of Western art. So choosing plants that don't have an established symbolic meaning allows Freud to strip the layers of cultural constructions over the plant to display something else, something that it's never purely simply aesthetic. As you can see, he paints every single detail with incredible accuracy. We're returning to the point I made earlier at the beginning of the talk, the intensity of the gaze of Lucian Freud, how he looks at plants and objects and subjects, different bodies in front of him, in order to capture what to him is essential to transfer the life, the essence of that being onto the canvas, is excruciating and beautiful at the same time. We see here the same reversal, background, foreground, that I showed you earlier in the previous work presenting us with Harry Diamond from 1951. In this case, it's a self-portrait of the artist on the left that we see shirtless, disappearing into a blurred background, cupping his ear, trying to listen to something. And this is where I think the painting becomes extremely fascinating. Art historians have had a long-standing issue talking about this painting. they've ignored it mostly. And those who have spoken about it have actually assumed, given for granted, that Lucian Freud is trying to hear something somebody else, another human, might be saying to him from the other side of the plant. Under no circumstances anyone has managed to entertain this idea long enough that perhaps the plant is the subject here of this listening, and that there is a humorous gesture or perhaps an existentialist desire to relate to a plant that it's been with us in the same environment through thick and thin, that's seen us cry and rejoice, ultimately as a companion, almost as if you would to a pet. I don't know what your relationships with plants are, but house plants tend to be different from plants in the garden when it comes to their histories, the shared histories they have with us, their sense of companionship. And in this case, one of the aspects of the listening that I found particularly fascinating about this painting is linked to my background in animal studies and the very famous passage in Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am, in which I trust some of you might have encountered, in which Derrida takes a shower and this is actually the apocryphal version of the reading, but the implication is that Derrida finds himself naked in his apartment, presumably after he took a shower, and is confronted by the gaze of his cat. And this confrontation, this return of the gaze, the cat looking back at him, triggers this incredible existentialist realization of the subjectivity of the cat, which then bursts into this incredible reflection on humanity that also, however, engages with notions of Christianity, shame, Adam and Eve, nudity, what does it mean to be naked? So let's say that in a sense, Derrida starts off with something really promising and that impacted the history of philosophy, made many philosophers and scholars look at animals, but he also strangely turned the cat into a metaphorical figure, into a religious figure, into a symbolic figure once again. And what I find interesting about Lucian Freud's encounter with the plant and this nakedness, which of course is purely incidental. Lucian Freud made this painting well before Derrida wrote about the encounter naked with his cat. But there is something really interesting here about this bareness, this nakedness, this primordial quality, this pre-cultural essence, if you like, in the encounter. The plant is what it is. If the question of can an animal ever never be naked can arise in animal studies, the plant is always naked. The plant is always surface. And it's this bareness, it's alignment between the silence, the possibility or impossibility to listen each other, but this nudity of both that I think in a way works, creates a strange assonance and a strange alignment with Lucian Freud's painting An Encounter with Plants. It's actually even more radical because the animal is able to return the gaze, but whenever we stare at our plants, wondering what is going on in you, what is going on between us, what is going on around us, the answer is most likely often frustrated. And it's a very important dimension. It's something to embrace, it's something to relish, and it's something to work with, which I think Lucian Freud did extremely well throughout his career. There's a lot of mystery around this painting and what led Lucian Freud to make this painting. But it's interesting that it's made at around the same time as the very mysterious and yet fascinating film, The Secret Life of Plants, which I strongly recommend. It never saw the light of day on DVD, VHS, because of some copyright issues with the soundtrack, which was by, nonetheless, Stevie Wonder. And it's available on YouTube. It's obviously legally been uploaded by somebody who wanted to make it available, and it's absolutely stunning. It's a film slash documentary based on a famous book that was published at the same time as the painting by Lucian Freud was made, which is based, the book is by Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bard. And the key inspiration behind the film is this experiment that was carried out by Cleve Baxter, a CIA interrogation specialist who hooked a galvanometer to the leaf of a plant he kept in his office and then begin to register the movements, the inner frequencies of the plant in relation to his thinking. So if he imagined to burn the leaf of the plant, he claims the galvanometer would register the unsettlement of the plant in terms of electrical signals. The experiments were never reproduced successfully to validate those finds, but nonetheless they spurred this incredible desire that still is with us today to play music to our plants, to talk to our plants, to engage with our plants beyond the silence. And this is the anthropomorphic trap that I've been talking about all along tonight. And I just want to wrap up the talk with some of the nudes by Lucian Freud to return to this very important idea that underpins his painting project. One of the things that's been said about Lucian Freud is that he elevated the mundane and the ugly. At some point, some critics unceremoniously called him the painter of the ugly. But I actually think that Lucian Freud was doing something very different, and you can see that something in many of the quotes he left behind. The man didn't speak a lot, but when he talks about rejecting symbolism, and he's very aware of what he does, and when he paints his nudes, he says that he wants to capture his sitters like animals in order to see something of them that it's truer to who they are beyond what people normally see. So the nude becomes political in this sense. It's a way of stripping off social class. You can see here that the title gives away the job of this lady. It's benefit supervisor sleeping, reinvented in a sense like a contemporary Venus that doesn't comply to the beauty or the canon of beauty of classical art. He negotiated the pose with the sitter in order to make sure that he wasn't imposing upon them absolutely anything. And as you can see, he doesn't even hide the studio. In this case, the shiki-shaki sofa was just planted there and used as a setting for this painting. This is the stripping of layers of cultural constructs through painting, through the realism that characterizes Lucian's way of addressing painting, which ultimately aims at capturing something else. And whatever he does, or whatever he used to do with painting, you had a sense that it would always try to reach that moment in which words crumble and language really loses its primacy. There is something about the way in which he addressed the subjects he painted, which is very egalitarian, that is very much geared to this idea of existentialism. What is the essence of you? What is the space between the two of us? What is this relationship we are having? And that is what he transfers, or what he practices perhaps even more with the plants. Because if his sitters don't give much back, as you can see, they're very enigmatic, they're very cryptic, then the plants gave back even less to work with. And it's that tension, I think, that he really enjoys. I remember once when I spoke to his daughter, Annie Freud, who spent quite a bit of time with me talking about the memory of his father for the book. She said, I think he had a problem with people who loved him too much. And he always enjoyed relationships with people that withdrew somehow, and that would allow a certain space, existential space, to happen. People who didn't display themselves right in front of him and show their devotion for him. And I think plants also do that pretty well, right? Those of you who have their house plants, you know the moments in which you feel like you just want to shake the plant and like, please tell me what is going on. And on that note, it's been a pleasure, and we made it to the end. I think we might have some questions, I hope. I'll be very happy to answer.
We do. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
I think I can.
Incredibly.
I will just jump right in. So I'm seeing a question from Pam. Did Dutch still lifes follow the same symbolism as those as the Moylissen work?
More or less, yes. Let's say that the Dutch still life is or the originator of the genre, in a sense, because of the Protestant church, and it then expands as a fashion across Europe. So you do encounter the genre of the flower still life spreading to Spain, France, Italy, and as it travels around Europe, the meanings change depending on the cultural connotation and just general local prescriptions, but the mechanics behind the idea are the same. The painting is not dedicated to a devotion to plants as much as it is to a devotion to beauty, the passing of time, and the Christian meanings that should be governing that beauty and the passing of
time. The next question partially has to do with still lives and their symbolism. Why do you think that still life paintings are considered a more basic skill? I'm assuming that means when learning drawing or painting, when they could have so much more depth as shown with Lucian Freud's work?
Great question, complicated to answer, but I can say that in the 1660s, the hierarchy of genres was consolidated by André Philibien, and the hierarchy of genres actually comes from Italy. It was developed in the academies of fine art, where it was decided that painting the human figure, anthropocentrism, therefore history, mythology, and religion, should occupy the highest rank of art making. Right below came subjects like personal portraits, because of course they're still connected to humans and power. And below, you would start to encounter animals, objects, landscape, and plants in different orders depending where you were situated geographically and culturally, but plants were certainly below animals. And that conditioning, that frame of mind, that thinking has impacted us in ways that we're not even aware of. It's with us all the time. When you think about the paradox, that eventually it is the paradox that has led us to climate change. Not on its own, of course, in combination with all the other disrespects and lack of interest for nature or looking at nature as a resource. The idea that nature is not worthy of our attention as much as religion, mythology, and history is symptomatic of our lack of understanding of what really matters on this planet, of how we've taken life upside down. And this crystallization that happens in the 1660s by André Philibien, who puts it in writing and therefore reperpetrates it across Europe and eventually across the world, is carried by our curators today. You know, in one of my essays, I did acknowledge the fact that artists have known better than the art historians and the curators who have really subscribed to that fabrication. Because when you look at the history of modern art, for instance, there are incredible paintings of flowers and plants by Impressionist artists. Think of Monet. they also relinquish symbolism, but they also relinquish realism. So in a sense, they settle for a different trade-off from Lucian Freud. What's outstanding about Lucian Freud is that he retains the realism of classical art, but still turns upside down that trope. And back to your question about specifically, I remember there was this point that was really important. Was it because it was deemed easier? Yes, it was, which sounds absolutely irrational, because painting a flower of the kinds I have showed you is extremely complicated. Also, those flowers came from life studies as well as study of botanical illustrations that needed to be transferred from a book into the painting with the right lighting. However, because the botanical genres, the painting of plants, was relegated to the lower ranks of painting, it became the activity of women. So that's how we find female artists focusing on plants and flowers, because they were excluded from painting naked people. They couldn't study the nude because it was deemed indecent for women to study the nude. And therefore, they couldn't paint religion, mythology, and history, which were the genres with all the naked people, which pushed them to paint the flowers and the plants. And then it becomes a vicious circle where this connections between patriarchy, femininity, and plants leads us to today, with our curators still mostly uninterested in the subject of plants and animals, for that matter, barely waking up to climate change 20 years too late. It's embarrassing. I really don't have much, I don't have kind words for history of art critics and curators for also influencing artists. I am very fond of all the artists that have emerged during the last century, who have just basically given the two fingers to all this attitude that if I engage with nature and plants and animals, I'm a sub-genre artist. I'm just going to do it anyway. And today, at least, something is changing, just because the planet is frying. But, you know, at least it is changing.
That last bit might relate to the second part of Audrey's question, which was, in your opinion, why do you think Freud's popularity was less in the United States than in Europe?
Very good question. I don't know that I have the exact answer, but it has been claimed that it's because the nudes are very raw and very confrontational. I mean, when you think about the tradition of classical art, nudes are always posed in a very indecorum, you know, this kind of like elegant and very modest way of exposing the body. Freud goes legs wide open, and you know, it makes it complicated for different cultures to relate to it, which I also think, excuse me, too much talking clearly, which I also think reflects his almost minor fame in Italy in comparison to the UK. You know, there's a certain wavelength, I think, that his nude portraits address, that it doesn't work particularly well in certain cultures, and he pays the expenses of it, which, you know, it's again testament to his determination to do what he wanted. And I also like to stress the fact that he wasn't wealthy, even if he came from an aristocratic, let's say, background. With his, well, aristocratic, he came from an upper middle class background, with his father being an architect. They lost everything by relocating to London in time, and Lucian Freud lived in squalor in some of the worst and most dangerous neighborhoods in London until his paintings began to sell again. And when the paintings began to sell again, he did the same that he was doing all along. He never really commercialized his work to make money, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I care when I say that he was, you know, loyal to his vision. It's easier to be loyal to your vision if you're wealthy and you don't have to worry about the financials than if you're not. And he was certainly not. So there's something valuable there.
Mm. There's an interesting question. Do you see a dissonance in characterization between a plant considered as a pet, or you said house companion, I like that phrase, as opposed to plants people use to fill space?
Could you repeat the beginning of the question, just the first few words?
Yeah, a dissonance in characterization between those two.
Yes, there is, absolutely. Many plants, I know some people think of plants as interior design elements. So when you bring a plant in the space as mainly interior design, it's very likely that when you change the sofa, the plant will go with it. So it ontologically aligns the plant differently than if you bring the plant into the space because of a different relational. For instance, this is actually an exception. I wanted a philodendron of this kind, and I really enjoy how the growth has been kind of like leading me to get to know the plant. You get to know these plants over years and years of spending time together and what they need and what they do. And I like challenges with plants, so I do end up bringing indoors plants that are not traditional house plants. And at that point, what we've just discussed, this idea of the houseplant that disappears as a design item or becomes a companion is different. You have to put a different level of care into a plant that is not necessarily a good house plant to make it happy. I did bring in a couple today because the temperature is no longer suited to some of them, and I've been very successful over time. You could trial and error, but there's something very important about this notion of domestic companion. It's not quite a pet, it's not quite a dog, but it's more than a chair. It's more than a lamp, and it's a very important ontological positioning that needs to be respected. A plant never is just interior design, and if that's how the plant enters the space, something is wrong in that relationship. It's about not acknowledging the livingness of the plant. The fact that the plant will have demands your sofa will not.
The next two questions are perhaps a little more personal. The first is, what started your fascination with Lucian Freud?
Interesting. Well, as I said earlier, I was fascinated by the talk in London when I arrived. Lucian Freud. Didn't know who he was, coming from Italy, and it was incredible to see his paintings. But I went to one exhibition in the early 2000s where the curators had the decency and shame to put together a room dedicated to his plant paintings, but it was very small. It felt like an add-on, like, oh, and by the way, he also painted plants, 3 paintings. But I remember stepping into that wing of the exhibition, into that gallery, and thinking, oh, I've stepped into like somebody else's show. It's like I thought this was just Lucian Freud. It really required a double take. It's like, how can he paint plants like this and people like that? So I was blown away. And his plants really stayed with me for a long time. I started to research how many there are. And I think it's when I moved away from London, when I moved here to Chicago, that thinking about Freud became a way to stay connected with the United Kingdom. So continuing my research about Freud, the plants, was also a way to keep a kind of umbilical cord tied to London. But there's something about the plants he paints that to me speaks very much a London interior, because the sun doesn't shine a lot in London and houseplants are not the happiest most of the times. And like Lucian Freud too, Sparmannia africana is not necessarily your average houseplant. It used to be in Germany and Austria in the 1920s and 30s, and then it kind of fizzled out. It's available in the US apparently. People do keep it on the porch or patio in the south. It grows really well. But it is one of those plants that will change its morphology almost beyond recognition by staying indoors. And that I also find interesting. The change to the body of a plant caused by this relationship, caused by this being together over time, as a dialogue instead of an imposition, as something that's like bonsai is a different thing. Bonsai is like molding the plant and guiding it. according to our willingness to shape it. And of course, the plant is not passive in that relationship either, because it's part of a dialogue where the plant opposes. But there is something different at play with the plant taking on a different morphology because of the situation it is in, because of your care, because of the relationship. I find that very interesting. It's a different dialogue, a different silent dialogue.
As a follow-up then, Regan's wondering what made you interested in plants?
Well, that is the beginning of time for me. So when I was a kid, I was interested in two things, nature and art. You know, in retrospect, I feel very lucky because I know people who had to find out what they were interested in later on in life. To me, the answer has always been there. It's like nature and art. But what was difficult was to find a way to make sense of these interests and make them financially viable as a profession, given the fact that in Italy you couldn't study plants and nature in connection to art. So one of the reasons why I moved to London is to study plants, animals, and art together, which I did at Goldsmiths. And Goldsmiths was very ahead of its time and experimental when it comes to allowing students to research the strangest subjects. But plants and animals have always been staples in my life, and nature generally. You can go through all sorts of things in life, but if you have nature as a rock, things somehow work out better. There's always something bigger than the pettiness that us humans are able to throw around and gigantify to return to. You know, there's always something more meaningful and more essential than that. And I always find peace of mind in the knowledge that exists. Unfortunately, I'm concerned about the rest of the world, and not just, you know, I'm not saying I'm unique. Many of you who are here tonight are probably along the same wavelength, but as you know, there is a strong majority out there who cannot see nature and doesn't care. And I wonder what a different world that is. And I hope it's happy, but it's different.
Mm. I'm gonna finish with one more question, and
Sure.
Thank you everyone for posting questions. So Lauren is asking, would you agree that communicating with plants would be similar to reading one's body language?
Yes, that's a very good analogy. It is, in a sense, akin to that, without, let's even like strip it further. When you read somebody's body language, you are accessing a vocabulary that is already partly at least yours. You know the pleasure that there is in knowing a friend for many, many years, right? You start to read them in ways that you only know. And you can predict certain things they're going to say. There's a kind of smirk or, you know, a little mannerism that you only see because it's somehow got registered in your brain. So it's that kind of body language. It's not the body language of deliberate expression, anger, fear, humor, joy. It's that nuanced body language that you develop over time through repetition, through paying attention. And that's one of the things I really like about Lucian Freud. He looked at everything he painted with incredible attention and devotion to detail. And I feel that that is a skill that we can appreciate through his paintings. The amount of looking that he has done in order to paint that Pandanus and the other plants is something that we can transfer to our lives, perhaps not with the obsessiveness that he was capable of. It was certainly a special case in that respect. But there is something important about slowing down. I think his paintings really invite us at a time where we seem, well, not right now specifically, but where our culture seems to be going faster and faster. Even online, we might not be moving around quite as much, but the internet is on fire, constantly spewing out perhaps even more information than before now that we're locked up. And I just feel that this observing of a plant. I just feel like I personally don't have the time to observe with the keenness, the dedication that he's at the time to do, because his job was to be a painter. And I think there's something there. There's a dimension of existentialism, a dimension of being present in that moment with that plant saying nothing, that it's spiritual in a sense, that's very special, and that I think it's important.
Fabulous. Melissa, if you want to ask your question, that'd be fine.
So I got booted off the internet for a couple minutes, so I pardon me if something has already been addressed from this question, but I keep thinking back to something you said about symbolic representation being a kind of violence to plants, because we're projecting our meanings. And then I'm kind of then thinking forward to Freud and his paintings, always feeling, I've always felt that those paintings, and especially his paintings of figures, were a little bit violent because of that intensity of that gaze, and because he makes everybody so bulgy and just a little bit distorted, or a lot distorted, and kind of puts them in these awkward positions, and then makes them sit for such long periods of time. And then I'm, sort of negotiating the kind of potential violence of doing that to his sitters with the kind of tenderness of the small mark making and the attention to detail. And then thinking about how that is sort of better matched to the speed that plants go, and that the paintings of plants don't feel, or when he treats the plant like that, it doesn't have that kind of aggressiveness. They seem to be more accepting of that scrutiny somehow. So I guess I wanted to sort of pose that observation, or the kind of difference in, I think some of what you talked about the distancing of, him appreciating people who were kind of indifferent to him, the plant being kind of the ultimate of in indifference. Could that somehow be a function of how fast or slow they live?
I guess it's tricky to say. I know quite a bit about his rhythms in terms of how he would orchestrate his days, work painting every day, usually in the afternoon and then in the evening, most times into the night. So let's say that he had an intensive relationship with painting. Very rarely a day would go by without him painting or drawing something. With the notion of slowing down, I guess that when that is your profession, it was consumed, utterly consumed by painting. That comes with it, when he didn't have to go to a day job in order to paint. So, in a sense, I think that allowed him to set his own rhythm that way. That also defined his ability to observe and the time that it was taken, that the observation took. But there's also something interesting about the violence. I think there is an important disambiguation here we need to draw between physical violence and representational violence. So the imposition of symbolism on plants is a representational violence, and many of the flowers and plants that we see in those still life paintings weren't even cut or killed for the making of the painting, because they came from either other people's paintings or botanical illustrations. So how he treats his models seems to vary a lot. And there are models who claim to have had absolutely extenuating relationships / experiences with them, and others who came back for more, regardless of the fact that he would take over 100 sittings and hundreds of hours. So again, the pose, which I thought was an interesting aspect, is actually negotiated in all times, even when it seems uncomfortable. And I think that is a big, important statement on his part on how he wants to keep the imposition that it's cultural, the imposition that is philosophical to a bare minimum. So he never tells his sitters, he would never tell his sitters, pose like Mona Lisa or pose like a Venus. It's this conversation between sitter and artist that generates the pose, even when it's very uncomfortable for them. So they're putting themselves in this situation. And in a sense, I guess what we can say about the staying the different pace with the plants also doesn't apply to his later paintings. So towards the last 15 years of his life, when he paints his garden, the brushstroke actually becomes very powerful and very expressionist almost. He tends to veer towards abstraction a bit. So I would somewhat resist generalizing. That's also one of the difficult aspects of pinning down Lucian Freud. It's how his style changes throughout his career, and he seems to do slightly different things. But of course, we have to remember that painting something, it's always a form of objectifying something. So we can't take that away, whether it's a person, whether it's a plant. But I think within that relationship of objectification, what he does really well is modulate this frequency between object and subject, so that the object is allowed agency to be what it is without disappearing under the cultural constructs that always inform our gaze. And therefore it's allowed to display something else of its awkwardness. You know, the awkwardness you see, Melissa, is actually there. I think as an actual awkwardness, Freud really chose his models based on their idiosyncrasy, based on how not traditionally beautiful they are. But the pose being awkward is also this, I think, I read it as this acknowledgement that life is awkward, that our place in life is always awkward, and that all those elegant poses of classical art are big lies. They're just like these moments of grandeur that have been portrayed as the normal, as the essence of what humans should aspire. But actually, what human is this kind of like splayed open legs and more kind of like haphazard situation that ends up being painful, that ends up being uncomfortable. I think there is a lot of truth there too.
I feel like I could go on.
Of course.
I'm not going to do that.
And
now.
and I hope we will at some point when I come back.
Yeah. Continue.
Dr. Aloi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and for answering our questions. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. And I hope to see you all soon in person or online, whichever comes first.
It works at this point. Thank you too, members of the audience, for being with us tonight.
Thank you again. Take care.
Have a good night, everybody.
You too.